Moving on to the next quote, we reach the second dialogue, which is entitled The Apology, or in Greek, Apologia. Some of Socrates' most well-known quotes come from the Apology, and one of them we're actually going to be taking a look at now. In this specific instance, Socrates is recounting a time where he engaged with someone who thought of himself more highly than he ought. At the end of the day, Socrates considered himself to be in a better position than this person because of the humility that he had in approaching difficult conversations and questions and topics. Let's take a look at this quote now in its context. When I began to talk with him, I could not help thinking that he was not really wise, although he was thought wise by many, and still wiser by himself. And thereupon I tried to explain to him that he thought himself wise, but was not really wise. And the consequence was that he hated me, and his enmity was shared by several who were present and heard me. As I read through the Apology and came across this quote, I couldn't help but think of the times where Paul talked about the wisdom of the world in places such as Romans and 1 Corinthians. For example, in Romans chapter 1, verse 22, when the Apostle Paul states that claiming to be wise, they became fools. These people thought that they were wise, but in reality, they were actually fools. It is very similar to the person that Socrates describes here in the Apology. This person was thought wise by many, and indeed he thought he was still wiser himself, but in reality he was not actually wise. The Apostle Paul elaborates on this point further in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 when he says that Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we as Christians preach Christ crucified, which is a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those of us who are called, it is the power and the wisdom of God. A few verses later, he says that God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. All of this to say, similar to the way Socrates condemns this person for thinking himself wiser than he actually is, the scriptures condemn us for thinking of ourselves wiser than we truly are, apart from the grace of God. The only way we can boast in our wisdom is if we actually know God, and it is impossible to know God for who he is unless we know the Lord Jesus Christ through the faith that God grants us. Building on this quote, Socrates continues by saying, "So I left him, saying to myself as I went away, well, although I do not suppose that either of us knows anything really beautiful and good, I am better off than he is. For he knows nothing, and thinks that he knows. I neither know nor think that I know. In this latter particular, then, I seem to have slightly the advantage of him. Then I went to another who had still higher pretensions to wisdom, and my conclusion was exactly the same. Whereupon I made another enemy of him and of many others besides him." Now, just as a quick sidebar, this quote is actually the source behind Socrates' most famous saying, when he says, "I only know one thing, and that is that I know nothing." It's actually a misquote of this specific passage. I neither know nor think that I know. With that quick sidebar out of the way, we can conclude this point by seeing where Socrates continues to build on the point that he was making in the previous quote. The idea that it is better for us to acknowledge that we know nothing because it keeps us humble and always seeking for wisdom. And in the Christian worldview, this wisdom is sought in the nature of God himself, which is revealed to us through the person of the Lord Jesus Christ. On the contrary, for those that think of themselves as wise and are trying to find wisdom in anything apart from the Lord Jesus Christ, they're only going to run into folly, because the wisdom of this world is actually foolishness in the eyes of God. As the Apostle Paul says himself in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 2, "I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." Let this quotation from Socrates serve as a great reminder not to think of ourselves more highly than we ought, but rather to continue seeking the wisdom of God reflected in the Lord Jesus Christ, because without him, we are fools, no matter how smart we actually think we might be.